concept of human photosynthesis and whether we could actually live on light alone. There's some yogis and so on who claim to do so. And of course, many people in the traditional thinkers, I would say, will write that off as, oh, it's impossible, right? But how many times have we been wrong about everything, and how many things are we probably wrong about now? Well, what if you would go barefoot on the earth and collect these electrons, and your body voltage neutralizes to the ground, and there's tons of evidence that it's neutralizing free radicals and inflammation in the body. And near infrared light in particular has a powerful effect on causing water to be structured in a way that it can conduct and store more energy, which is basically what's happening in our cells. That's what he's showing in his research.
I want to limit this blue light during the day, this artificial junk light from my screens and TV. What's your go-to recommendation? Matt, welcome to the podcast. I've been waiting for this day, so I'm glad it's finally here.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. So I've been a fan of what you've been doing since you've been out. I've been cheering you on from the sidelines. I don't know if you know that or not, but I don't know how we haven't connected properly, but I'm glad it's finally happening.
Yeah, me too. I appreciate that, by the way.
Of course. So let's dive into it. I heard, someone told me that you were similar to me, kind of a weird health nerd as a kid. Like, I was a kid packing the random superfoods in my lunch in middle school and high school, and I was weird, and I didn't care. I didn't care that I didn't fit in. I just wasn't. It was not even on my radar. Is that the case for you? Did I hear that correctly?
Yes. So when I was a teenager, all the health issues I had as a kid, so gut issues, allergies, and headaches, kind of all came to a head. They culminated with some really severe, I was having allergy attacks and migraines and terrible bouts of just gas and bloating, like in school. I mean, it was so uncomfortable and torturous. Mm-hmm. And finally, I just realized that Western medicine really wasn't helping. I had to start figuring things out for myself. I had gone to naturopaths as well, who also unfortunately weren't able to help. So there was something else that had to be out there. With Western medicine, the pediatricians gave me Advil, and for my headaches, the allergists, they gave me antihistamines, and the gastroenterologist, most shockingly of all, I would say, gave me Tums for my gut issues. So I was thinking, like, okay, what's happening here? They're not addressing any root cause. And then through a kind of roundabout way, I got the idea as a teenager that maybe my diet played a role, even though nobody ever really told me that. They say, oh, eat healthy, but I didn't really have any connection in my mind that eating unhealthily could actually contribute to these serious issues, because everybody says, oh, it's just genetic. My mom has allergies. Somebody else has headaches. So, yeah.
Yeah. So how did you unlock that keyhole, so to speak? How did you find out what was the pieces to the puzzle? How can you start feeling better? What was that aha moment?
So I was eating some like French fries, some unhealthy fried food, full of seed oils and things. And I started getting really bad breakouts on my skin. And then my mom was, she told me this kind of maybe half-baked, maybe not theory that, all the greasy food could cause breakouts. And I was like, well, interesting. Maybe something's wrong with my gut. That came to me because then that grease and oil and all this is just kind of going into my bloodstream, into my skin. This was kind of just the thing that came through my mind, the idea. And still not sure if that's exactly 100% what was happening in that situation and what was triggering these breakouts. However, the idea that I should heal my gut led to the whole concept of ancestral eating and the paleo diet to start. And this was, for me, a significant breakthrough, because as soon as I got the idea, like, oh, this modern way of eating is really unnatural and really not healthy, I thought, well, I'd better change this immediately as soon as possible and start making these modifications. And the paleo diet for me led to even an autoimmune paleo diet, because I thought, well, I should go stricter because I was still having some symptoms even though the paleo diet actually made me feel much better in the beginning. And then that led to the GAPS diet, which many people do now, but this was in 2015. Nobody was talking about this in 2015. Very few
Yeah.
people were. You were
Yeah.
actually, but not a lot of people were. So I was on like the fringe corners of the paleo forums on the internet.
Yeah.
There was keto, there was zero carb, they called it. Now they call it carnivore. So anyway, this is the kind of stuff I was experimenting with. And then for me, where I'd say the light bulbs really began, pun kind of intended, was when even with the strictest so-called healing diets like the GAPS diet, I was actually struggling more than I was initially in some respects, mentally, energetically. So I was trying to push myself to be super keto, but I just didn't feel good. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of the time they say, oh, you have to be keto, to reduce your, there are a lot of different theories people were throwing around to reduce your deuterium levels in your blood. And there's a variety of other reasons, of course, for keto. But I didn't feel good. I felt bad. I actually felt like I was depriving myself. I was starving myself in some respects as a teenager. I'd go out with my friends and I'll be eating chips and normal foods. And not that those things are healthy, but I was like, wouldn't let myself have a morsel of anything. And then
Yeah.
if I did, I feel like I was going to die because my immune system would be reactivated. The whole AIP thing. If you have one little
Hmm.
grain of anything, you're going to
Hmm.
die. Your immune system's going to go crazy. Not die, but I'm
Yeah. Yeah.
exaggerating
It's the
theory.
yeah fear and anxiety around food. Yeah, I get it.
I was living in tremendous fear and anxiety, and I honestly think my symptoms regressed, and I felt even worse.
Yeah.
So then I came across this research on it kind of in the dark night of the soul, because I ended up actually with a sort of cyclical binge eating disorder, going from super strict dieting to just completely off the rails, eating whatever I could possibly stomach, because I thought,
Yeah.
well, I've ruined it. I have to start from scratch. So I might as well just enjoy everything I can. It was really rough. And as a teenager, anyway, the light bulb, let's say, finally came for me when I came across a blogger and some different research talking about mitochondria and circadian rhythms, and how you could be eating a perfect food diet, but you could be exposed to different factors in the environment, such as light, which is incoherent with our natural biological rhythm, which can disrupt the mitochondrial function and thereby damage the body's ability to properly utilize food. And there are
Hmm.
many other factors, but toxins and lack of sunlight and electromagnetic radiation, for example. But that opened my mind to, I would say, biophysics, so a broader realm of health and energy than just food alone. And that's where things started to get really interesting for me.
Oh, this is so good, man. So you unpacked a lot of things, and I'm sorry you went through that journey. We're talking about like as a young kid being a health nerd. Mine was out of like curiosity and wasn't out of sort of health reasons. Your journey is actually very different than me. And my heart goes out to you because I see so many people in that space that are kind of immersing themselves in feeling better. They've gone through a lot of trauma, when I call it symptoms. It really impacted their quality of life. And they, don't want to go back to how they were feeling. And like you said, you were feeling good for a time, but then we have to check ourselves. And we talk a lot on the podcast about orthorexia, which is what it sounds like you kind of got to, where it's a disordered eating around healthy foods and become so hyper focused. And that stress and anxiety is adding and contributing to that problem. And we're not looking at the larger picture of like, yes, food is a piece of the puzzle, and certainly it is, and we'd still say that, but it's not the only piece of the puzzle. And we kind of become so myopic and hyper focused. It's not good from a mental health standpoint, which is going to obviously impact your physiology in a way. So thank you for sharing that journey. I think a lot of people can learn from that and check themselves and saying, okay, am I like really doubling down on this as being my only piece of the puzzle, but looking at the larger facets of human health. You talked about biophysics, and let's maybe start with defining that. And I really want to get into light and the science of light.
Yeah, absolutely. So biophysics, I'll give my understanding of the definition with the disclosure that I'm, not an expert MD, PhD. I'm a high school graduate who just did a lot of research, and now I'm an entrepreneur with the business,
Love it.
making projection. But with that said, I understand biophysics to basically be the science that studies the interaction or kind of overlap between biology and physics. In other words, the physics of organisms, the physics of how biological systems work.
Mhm.
So for me, the things that I lump into biophysics is, for example, understanding how electromagnetic fields affect biological systems. So electromagnetic fields, this could be, radio waves and the kind of non-native, as they call it, radiation that quite a extensive body of research has indicated can be deleterious to our health in a variety of ways, but also the visible and invisible spectra that do come to the earth through the atmosphere from the sun, and we have evolved for, have in many respects shaped our evolution. So for me, a really fascinating concept to start to understand was when I was studying mitochondria. There's a gentleman named Dr. Douglas Wallace who's primarily based at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and UPenn, which is actually the city I grew up in Philadelphia.
Oh,
So
cool.
when I was learning all this stuff, I actually remember this was a really funny situation. I was sitting at a dinner table with my mom and a good friend of hers who was a neurologist at UPenn. And I was obsessed as a teenager, as I mentioned, obsessed with this stuff. And I thought I found all the answers once I learned about the light stuff. There was more, actually. So that wasn't the end of the story, to be clear. There's more to discuss. But basically, I think I'm sure I became orthorexic about the light and biophysics stuff. But anyway, we'll table that for now. So this doctor, he says to me, the neurologist, he says, "Oh, I know Doug." I was talking about Doug Wallace, the researcher. He's like, "Oh, he works down the hall." I was like, "You're kidding me. No way." So this guy who I'm fascinated with, all of a sudden, my mom's friend introduces us, and I go down and meet him and start chatting with him. And he was a fascinating guy. I mean, he was in his 70s, probably late 70s, 80s now. And basically, what Doug Wallace did was when all of his colleagues in the 80s and so on were beginning their careers and researching the genetic causes of diseases, he began researching mitochondria because they also have their own genome, right? And he's like, well, somebody should look at this. And because this is kind of on the heels of the discovery of DNA. And so, everybody was going that direction, trying to find the cause of disease. And then I think it's something like hundreds of billions, or maybe even, yeah, maybe tens of billions of dollars later, invested into medical research in the genes. They kind of have had to admit that they haven't found anything meaningful as far as like actual diseases caused by genes, except there's those few that are very well known, Tay-Sachs, sickle cell anemia, and cystic fibrosis. And I would wager that there is still even an energetic mitochondrial component because you need energy to copy and transcribe the genes because all the energy comes from the mitochondria. But anyway, so Doug Wallace, all the while, was studying rare mitochondrial disorders, but then somehow started to realize that, well, wait a minute, like maybe there's an element of mitochondrial, dysfunction here, here, here. And then all of a sudden it's like he now goes and lectures and shows these charts with the data and the evidence showing that pretty
Mhm.
much every modern chronic illness has a mitochondrial element. One could even argue a primarily mitochondrial basis. So,
Mhm.
you look at from developmental disorders of autism and so on. The mitochondria are inherited from the mother. That was one of their huge discoveries. And because of that, they were able to map human migration patterns out of Africa pretty uh, certainly because there's just a single change in the mitochondrial haplotypes over generations versus the DNA being spliced every single generation with the nuclear DNA. So that actually gave them the ability to see like, oh, these people have this many base pair differences between their mitochondrial DNA, here in Asia and North America and so on. And they were able to kind of confirm those migration patterns with that uniparental inheritance of mitochondria, meaning they come from the mom. But so anyway, then a developmental disorder like autism, one could posit that the mother has mitochondrial issues that she passes to the children, for example, right? Or there's
Mhm.
a lot of other things that can contribute to developmental illnesses, which I won't talk about right now, but I think you know what I mean. Anyway, like mercury, for example.
Yeah.
So in the brain, but anyway, so then you have many other diseases like modern issues adults face. You have, well, I had allergies, gut issues, right? Headaches. There are all the chronic diseases you treat and help people with: autoimmune disease, diabetes, diabetes, I should call it diabetes, but diabetes,
It's good.
obesity,
Yeah.
heart disease, cancer, and so on and so forth. And they've actually effectively found Alzheimer's and so on, neurodegenerative diseases, that these are linked to mitochondrial issues. So anyway, that's Dr. Wallace's research. And for me, that was fascinating. Like, whoa,
Yeah.
mitochondria. And then, there are other researchers in other fields of work, bodies of work, speaking about and researching how different lifestyle factors, but particularly, again, biophysical things like light, influence mitochondrial health. And I found that fascinating. So, for example, that red light and near infrared light actually improve mitochondrial function, and that these are natural components of daylight. In fact, near infrared makes up about 40% of the light of the sun that reaches us on Earth at any point in time. And fun fact, modern artificial lights have virtually no near infrared. They've cut it out because of energy efficiency concerns, which is a real health concern that we're now
Hmm.
addressing with my company and our lighting development department. But basically, the near infrared and red light was always around and our cells used it, but then we just cut it out. And now we live inside behind windows that filter the near infrared and lights that also just don't emit it in the first place. So these are things that really started to fascinate me. Like, what if you actually go back into the natural environment and get those wavelengths of light, or use a kind of supplemental therapeutic device, but best always to get out in nature, just like it's best to eat the whole food. What if you would go barefoot on the earth and collect these electrons, which the research is shockingly clear in my opinion and experience reading it, that you just go barefoot on the earth and your body voltage neutralizes to the ground, and there's tons of evidence that it's neutralizing free radicals and inflammation in the body. And that would be like what I would consider a biophysical effect. So kind
Yeah.
of a lengthy answer to your question, but that's how I view biophysics and why
Man,
it's so
it's
significant.
fascinating. Such an eloquent way of putting it. So, all right. We talk about light. I want to dive into the different wavelengths and kind of demystify it for people because you mentioned a few there. But can we back up a little bit further? Like, I'm curious of because I sense this sort of your resonance, if you will, with the resonance of light and frequency of light, where there's almost like a spiritual component. I believe there's a spiritual component to light and humans' relationship with light. So I've never had the chance or opportunity to talk about it with somebody on the podcast. So, like, what's your view on this? As someone who like lives and breathes light, like, how far back primordial light and human relationship? What's it look like in your mind?
Well, I think it goes back really far, right? There are different theories about the origin of life and where life began. Some hold that it began at the bottoms of the oceans. There's Dr. Nick Lane from the UK who talks about the alkaline hydrothermal vents at the ocean floor, which there's a slow percolation, not the big black smokers, but there's another type of vents where there's a slow kind of percolation of these alkaline fluids and chemicals and so on coming from inside of the earth, mixing with the relatively acidic seawater. It's not that it's acidic, but relatively it is. And there's this gradient, a pH gradient, which provides energy for a lot of reactions. And according to his theories, and they've actually used like a benchtop reactor in a lab to kind of simulate some of this and seen chemicals coming together. But anyway, so some theories hold that life began at the bottom of the ocean and then slowly made its way. So if that's the case, then we weren't necessarily exposed to sunlight in the beginning, but eventually were exposed. And as life does, it adapts to things. And well, it's kind of like a big ball of fire, free energy, which cells could use. So there are others that hold that life began like in the places where foam develops on beaches, or on the kind of the in between areas where again there's a lot of action happening there on the edges of the oceans. But whatever it is, at an early point in our development, obviously we were exposed to light, and obviously our cells began to utilize it. I would give an analogy that Dr. Alexander Wunsch, who's our scientific advisor based out of Germany, gave me, that light is an energy source. And just like imagine, people can visualize when you have wind blowing through a desert, you can see the energetic, if you will, patterns of the wind left in the desert sand. That's what makes the sand look all cool, typically. And similarly, especially as really early developing organisms, light is a form of energy that was basically passing through us. And our biological systems are, he argues, made a compelling case to be shaped by light, right? So because, well, this is a particularly interesting side note, but if you look at the spectrum of the sun, there is this phenomenon called the Fraunhofer lines. So the in the chromosphere of the sun, there's a variety of heavier elements because the sun makes everything from hydrogen all the way up to the heavier metals, and the heavier ones go to the outside of the sun. And so when light is coming out of the center of the sun, making its way out and then coming to Earth eventually, that light has certain wavelengths which are absorbed by those elements on the chromosphere. So if you look at the spectrum of the sun reaching Earth, it's not exactly continuous. There's these black lines that represent the elemental absorption of all the different elements in the sun. And his argument to me, which I found quite interesting, is that the absence of those particular wavelengths of light in sunlight actually give life the opportunity to exist. They give life, like, especially at the early stages, a sort of playground in which for reactions to occur. Because if those wavelengths were all coming, there would have been no sort of biophysical, let's say, reason for these reactions to occur in biochemistry. So interesting one, kind of gets seemingly a little
Yeah.
esoteric, but anyway, for me, taking it to something a little bit more tangible, which is also really well studied in modern science, or I shouldn't say well studied, but it is studied, and it's fairly well studied. It's just not something everybody knows about. But it doesn't mean it's not well studied, as you know, right? There are things that are
Yeah.
well studied, nobody's ever heard of them. And this is biophoton research. So, and I'm skipping ahead here for a moment, but happy to get into all the different science of light. That's what we love to talk about at my company, but basically, and what I love to talk about personally. But anyway, as my journey progressed, I mentioned earlier that the light stuff wasn't the end of it, right? There was more. I became, as I mentioned, orthorexic about the light stuff. I became obsessed that I had to be in the sun this much, and a little
Interesting.
bit of blue light at night would kill me, disrupt my
Yeah.
melatonin. So I took the same orthorexia and plopped it down onto my
Understood.
light experience. And for me, that started to break only years later. So the whole journey started when I was around 14 and in the world of diets, freshman in high school. By 16, I was deep into the light research. That was 2 years later. By 18, I was graduating high school and starting my business. And then, 3 years after that, I was struggling mentally. So it's like I'm doing all this stuff for my health, the diets and the light stuff. Physically, I feel better. I look better. I'm healthier. My labs I've done show that I'm healthier, but I felt empty and lonely and kind of depressed still. And I was like, but I'm doing all the right stuff. Shouldn't my brain chemistry be optimized, my dopamine levels? Because that was something I was, reading about, is light and its connection to serotonin and dopamine and so on. Shouldn't
Hmm.
all this be optimized by now? And clearly something was off. Maybe
Yeah.
my neurotransmitter levels were fine. I didn't test those actually specifically, but something wasn't right. And so I started looking for a more spiritual, solution. And I came across a variety of different teachers over the years, but one who really struck me was Dr. Joe Dispenza. And, he does a great job, I would say,
Yeah.
taking scientific research and making it relevant for meditation, or looking at the research around this. And they're doing a ton of research at his organization. But the way he was able to explain these concepts really struck me and caused me to research even further and look at more old traditions. I have a good friend who's an Ayurvedic doctor from India and lived as a yogi and a monk for several years, and had shared many of these spiritual concepts with me. But so tying this together with biophotons, on my journey along the way, I started reading these books. One was The Body Electric by Robert O. Becker, which talks about how, and pretty much shows that our body, through his experiments, is electromagnetic in its function. So our body
Hmm.
uses electromagnetic fields. Electromagnetic fields guide the differentiation of cells
Mm.
from a, you know stem cell essentially into all the differentiated cells. he pointed out, Becker, this black hole in biology, if you will, that all of our cells have the same 23 chromosomes. And yet some cells turn into an eye, and some cells turn into a liver and a kidney and genitals and toes and, all sorts of different uh, types of cells coming from the same genetic information. So, what's informing and instructing those cells to become what they need to be, where they need to be? And what he found was that it has to do with electromagnetic fields. And
Hmm.
so that was really fascinating for me, right? And
Yeah.
he got involved in the controversy because his predecessor, protege, Andrew Marino, actually was researching how external fields like EMF power lines and so on, this is the 80s, could affect living systems, and found all sorts of issues from these fields. And then they started defending farmers who were suing the state of New York for building high voltage lines over their farms, saying it was affecting the milking patterns of the chickens and the egg laying of the milking of the cows, egg laying of the
We
chickens, mixing
that
of
would
animals,
that
whatever.
would that would really be difficult. Yeah. We would not want that milking practice.
No, that would
I
not
knew
be
I knew
good.
what you meant. I knew what you meant.
Yeah, you know what I mean. So anyway, so they were defending these people in court, and then all mysteriously, the judges were being swayed by the power companies to rule in favor, even when the evidence was clearly not in favor of the power companies. So
Yeah.
all this is to say, super fascinating stuff that
It
Becker was
is so
shedding light on.
fascinating. Yeah.
And then on the other hand, there was a great book. You may have heard of this or seen it. It's called Light Shaping Life, Biophotons in Biology and Medicine. It's a textbook by a Dutch guy named Roland van Wyk, who basically broke down the German and Russian and American research on biophotons over the previous century, which is absolutely fascinating, literally showing from the beginning with people like Alexander Gurwitch and Fritz Albert Popp. So you have a Russian there and a German, actually two Germans in that case, who literally found that the stimulus for mitosis, so such a fundamental process for living systems, cell division,
Hmm.
is small pulses of extreme low frequency ultraviolet light. And that our
Interesting.
cells literally communicate with light, and we are beings of light, not in a spiritual woo woo kind of sense, but factually what the
Yeah.
research is doing. So to answer your question, to put it all together, like this stuff I had read, but I didn't
Hmm.
think that there was a more spiritual application of that research immediately in those earlier days when I was learning about the stuff. But years later, when I was struggling mentally, still feeling, I was running a business, traveling around the world, making money and having freedom, thinking, oh, I should be happy, but wasn't feeling it. And it was when I started diving into a spiritual approach to things, actually taking my attention, and your attention is your energy essentially, right? That's why social
Hmm.
media companies want to take your attention. They're taking your energy. And if you take that attention and focus it inward rather than on Instagram or something, you're actually giving your energy to your different, for example, energy centers. If you choose to meditate and focus on these nerve clusters where tons of energy is concentrated in our body. So I found that fascinating, and that added a whole other dimension to me for the healing journey. And I would add that I really believe, you talk about root causes and things and what may have been the cause. I came to believe that sure, the diet stuff contributed to my health issues, and certainly the EMF and blue light from the television throughout my childhood and lack of sunlight all also exacerbated the different health issues and, let's say, predispositions, anything I had going on. But I look back on my life, and it became pretty clear to me that the stress as a kid of certain things that happened in my life, parents separating at a young age, and there's some hostility and tension and fighting and stress and
Yeah.
instability, was creating a permanent, that I was still wrapped up in it until that time, which is why I was constantly suffering a kind of permanent state of stress, which I would always feel in my lower gut, basically my lower abdomen, near my navel and below.
Mm.
And that it started to click to me, like, well, wait a minute, if a kid feels like that, and that was my default my entire life,
Yeah.
of course I'm gonna have gut issues. How am I gonna digest food if I'm constantly in stress? Like,
Yeah.
anybody knows if you're super stressed, you're trying to do a phone call and eat at the same time, probably gonna have indigestion. But that was my life, and I had never known another way. So it was really resolving. And as people would say, oh, emotions are the majority, or stress is the majority of what causes diseases today. And I was like, nah, that's impossible. It's your light and your diet and this. And then I came to believe that that very
Yeah.
thing is the case for myself and maybe
Yeah.
for most.
Yeah, I love it. Thanks for highlighting that. No, we talk about this quite a bit on the pod, is having this sort of both and not either or approach. And like that, I talk about gut feelings and like dealing with the gut and the feelings, and they're both. And for some people, it's like with telehealth patients, some people that mental emotional piece is a significant piece of the puzzle. For some people, it's a smaller piece of the puzzle. So for some people, the food environmental toxin piece is massive. Some people, it's small. So it's not like this pie chart that having sort of this holistic view, if you will. And I'm so happy you unlocked that for you. So okay, let's define the different wavelengths. You mentioned infrared, the different infrared wavelengths. What is the spectrum of light that people are being exposed to, both natural and unnatural, throughout the day?
Yeah, absolutely. So the electromagnetic spectrum, as they call it, is a range of wavelengths of light. So wavelengths are how we measure light, basically electromagnetic radiation. So because light operates as a wave, they've also found it operates as a particle, but that's a physics discussion for another time, for another day. So light flows as waves, and the wavelength is basically the space between the crests or the troughs of that wave. It's measured in nanometers because it's really, really tiny. So that's what wavelengths are in light, the electromagnetic spectrum. So on the one end, you have what they call ionizing radiation. So ionizing radiation is radiation that has enough energy per photon to break apart atoms. So the core of an atom, the nucleus of an atom, and if you knock off a neutron, you've ionized that atom. Well, anyway, so this is one type of radiation which is very powerful, and exposure to this, like Chernobyl, think Chernobyl, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nuclear reactors, the sun puts off ionizing radiation, X-rays, gamma rays, etc. We don't get a lot of that on Earth, right? Unless you're dealing with radioactive substances, you're not getting a lot of that. But that causes a lot of issues, of course, and everybody knows that, and it's impossible to deny, because you start bleeding out from the insides, like literally your molecules and atoms are being torn apart.
Yeah.
So that's something that is well understood, pretty well understood. So everybody, people have heard of the researchers who studied this and ended up with all sorts of health complications. So then,
Mm-hmm.
on the other hand, you have non-ionizing radiation, and the visible light spectrum, interestingly, is kind of right in the middle between the two. So in the visible light spectrum, we have the reds and infrareds, which are closer to the non-ionizing side of the spectrum, and then you have short wavelength blue light, and then ultraviolet A, ultraviolet B, even ultraviolet C sometimes, which are closer to the ionizing part of the spectrum. They're not really ionizing forms of radiation, though. They can do other things to molecules, which we'll talk about in a second. But basically, that's the spectrum. The non-ionizing side, then beyond visible light, is things like radio waves and radar. So these are much longer waves, and these are used primarily for communication today. So just touching on the non-natural ones first for a moment, humans figured out by shaking electrons in an antenna that we can create these radio waves, and that they are very useful for communication purposes. Unfortunately, for us, a bunch of researchers have found that there are health effects from these radio waves and all sorts of longer wave radiation used for communication. We're talking Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, cell phone signals, and so on and so on. So,
Mm-hmm.
and the kinds of health issues they were finding were cataracts, cancer, and so on. So it's unfortunate because I'm using Wi-Fi right now. In fact, like it's convenient stuff for us to be able to do a lot, but I do wonder about the long-term consequences of this. I mean, I've spoken to some of these researchers, and one of whom, who is based out of Berkeley and was kind of has been sounding the alarm for years, who wouldn't even own a cell phone. That's how concerned they were about these things. Or, and if they did,
Yeah.
it would just be simple flip phones. So because the new phones are more and more powerful. But anyway, so
Yeah.
speaking of visible light, the range that we're going to be primarily concerned with here, that's the range that is transmitted through the atmosphere because it's not filtered out. All the other stuff is effectively filtered out, and the sun emits basically all of that. but the ionizing and the non-ionizing, but the visible spectrum plus what we don't see, ultraviolet and infrared, is what reaches us. So anyway, as far as how these affect life, I'll preface with saying I used to have a bit of a different view years ago when I first got into this. Obviously everybody's views evolve and change over time. And I was following some people I considered experts. Some of them were experts, some not as much, who really emphasized that we should be getting tons of ultraviolet light, that ultraviolet light is like our savior, right? Now, ultraviolet light does have certain health benefits, right? And most people are super deficient. Most people, you can see somebody's really pale. Basically, that tells you that they're vitamin D deficient. Um, Vitamin D has all sorts of health benefits, of course, as you know, that are, I would say, different when you get them from the sun than when you take a supplement. And there's a decent body of research around that.
Yeah.
So,
Mm-hmm.
so anyway, our body, the body has figured out how to use these powerful wavelengths of light to basically stimulate the conversion of certain molecules into other molecules, which are biologically useful. Now, as I began working with Dr. Alexander Wunsch, who, by the way, would also make a very interesting guest for your podcast sometime down the road,
Sure.
happy to arrange that. He's the photon expert. But anyway,
Have them on for sure.
yeah, absolutely. So basically, as I began working with him, I got a bit of a more nuanced perspective that it's not necessarily that ultraviolet is, of course, all bad. And I was coming from the camp later in my journey that it's actually amazing and we want to get as much as we can, but that there's somewhere in the middle, right? So the World Health Organization, they classify ultraviolet as a carcinogen. Well, okay, maybe in excess, it could be. And then on the other hand, you have people now in the health world saying, well, you should get as much as you can,
Living outside. Yeah.
And really, as is often the case, the answer, I believe, is somewhere in the middle, right?
Yes.
It's beneficial to get a certain amount of ultraviolet light, but it's not beneficial to get too much. And so we have to be reasonable. There's the thesis, the antithesis, and then the synthesis in the middle of these different theories.
So good.
Almost always. So living organisms actually, as Dr. Wunsch explained to me, actually evolved to protect from ultraviolet light. If you look at bacteria, they can't tolerate ultraviolet light. You don't have bacteria growing. Just an easy example, you don't have bacteria growing in a place where it's sunny and bright. You have bacteria, mold, and these kinds of things occurring in dark, damp, dingy kinds of places, right? That's where they like to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so to become an organism, which eukaryotes have, that can actually withstand solar radiation, we had to develop very robust systems to protect against ultraviolet radiation. And our skin is a perfect example of this. Our skin is very much designed to not let light pass through, to neutralize the light. We have pigment called melanin, of course, as you know, which basically takes the high-powered ultraviolet light and with very high efficiency basically absorbs it and re-emits near infrared, so heat. So this is a really phenomenal biological development that we've made. So ultraviolet light has benefits such as vitamin D production. It also stimulates some other processes as well, like nitric oxide, for example, via the skin. So there are certain positives of ultraviolet, but we don't want to overdo it. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, I mentioned this briefly earlier, but there's the red and the near infrared, the longer wavelengths. And in general, a great way to break apart the spectrum is within the visible light spectrum is the shorter and the longer wavelengths. So shorter being kind of the green, blue, and ultraviolet, and then indigo and so on, but lumping them all together around blue and violet and ultraviolet. So then you have the red and near infrared, and just there's orange and yellow, but they're relatively small bands if you look at the spectrum. These are more regenerative healing wavelengths. And so this has been proven now with thousands of peer-reviewed studies on red and near infrared light therapy, also known as photobiomodulation or low-level laser therapy, because they originally were just using lasers for this. But these wavelengths, the main way that they work is enhancing mitochondrial energy production. They also work by affecting the structure of water. So I imagine you're familiar with Dr. Gerald Pollack and the fourth phase of water. So tons of evidence that near infrared light in particular has a powerful effect on causing water to be structured in a way that it can conduct and store more energy, which is basically what's happening in our cells. That's what he's showing in his research. The
Gel,
water in our cells is in bulk water, like in a
the
glass.
gel water. I've heard him talk about
Yeah.
gel
Gel
water.
water, they
Yeah.
say EV, exclusion zone water, because in the beginning they just found that the structured water excluded these nanoparticles that they would put in the water during their experiments. So they called it easy, but yeah, gel water, it's
Yeah.
kind of like, if you think of it, an egg white, it's
Yeah.
something like 99% water, but it
Yeah.
has a very different texture and consistency than, bulk water in a glass. So anyway, these red and near infrared wavelengths have positive effects on mitochondrial energy production. Some studies have even shown that they allow the mitochondria to produce ATP even in the absence of food, which I found really interesting, because I'm really
Yeah.
interested in the concept of human photosynthesis and whether we could actually live on light alone. There's some yogis and so on who claim to do so. And of course, many people in the traditional thinkers, I would say, we'll write that off as, oh, it's impossible, right? But how many times have we been wrong about everything, and how many things are we probably wrong about now? Well, must be a lot, because everybody has, 1 in 2 people has a chronic illness. So we clearly
Yeah.
don't know everything about biology. So to act like we know everything, it's a little ridiculous. Maybe there's something to be gleaned from these more esoteric philosophies. But
Well
anyway,
said. Well
people have
said.
claimed to live without food for years. So, well, I'm thinking maybe there's a basis for that. Maybe it would be a healthy way to live. Who knows? So my kind of brand and things I talk about are the light diet, not in the sense of not eating food, but in the sense of, getting healthy light. But who knows that in English, it's light and light are the same word: light, lacking mass, light, electromagnetic radiation. So in other languages, they're different, but in English, it kind of works. So who knows, maybe there's actually a light diet that we want to eat less food. And well,
Yeah.
it's not all that crazy, because, as I understand from what I've read and researched, the single factor that is proven to consistently extend lifespan and healthy lifespan is fasting, reduction of calorie
Mhm.
intake, right? Well, that sounds a lot like a light diet, like eating less
Yeah.
food. Doesn't mean
Hey.
so. Anyhow,
Yeah.
so longer wavelengths have those effects on the mitochondria, and they're very beneficial. We want to be getting that, especially in today's world where we're indoors and we're lacking the red and near infrared wavelengths. We're working at my company on a red light therapy device. Now, you can pretty much buy them anywhere. We decided we were only going to make one because customers asked us many times if it was actually significantly different and better than what else is out there. And so I'm glad more than 2 years later, we've been able to do that. And that's
Amazing.
coming kind of soon. And different mixture of wavelengths based on the research, different frequency modes, which allow people to affect these biological systems based on the expertise of our scientific advisor and his background in studying frequency and how it affects the body and different systems. So people can actually pulse the light at different frequencies and so on, in addition to the broader range of wavelengths we offer based on the research. But anyway, so red and near infrared light, very beneficial. Now, just to touch on the blue light, because that's the kind of part I've skipped over, but that's the kind of saving the best for last. That's part of the short wavelength side of the spectrum. And the short wavelengths are very stimulative. So the short wavelengths, they stimulate our biological systems. Blue light affects our chronobiology, so our circadian rhythm, right? And another fascinating fact I learned this is why I love working with experts, right? You get really a lot of clarity, I would say, on nuance. At least that's been my experience. And so I went and asked Dr. Wunsch, why is it that organisms chose blue light to tell the change of, the time of day? Is it just because my idea or understanding was that because blue shifts a lot throughout the day, from sunrise to sunset, it shifts more than almost any other color or range of light wavelengths, except ultraviolet. But ultraviolet typically isn't even present at sunrise because it's filtered through the atmosphere. So it seemed like blue light was a natural choice from my perspective then. But that didn't exactly explain, like, biophysically why the organism would use blue light. It could potentially pick green or something else. Well, an interesting way of putting it that he shared with me is that, as I mentioned earlier, life has to take care of or protect from ultraviolet wavelengths, because they have the power. So they're not breaking apart the core of the atoms like X-rays and gamma rays, but they do have the ability to knock electrons off of these atoms and molecules in our body. And that's creating what we call free radicals, right? Because when you knock off the electrons, then those atoms or molecules lack that chemical stability and they want to go and steal electrons from another place. And in an organism, that's problematic because everything wants to be balanced and stable. And so those are called free radicals, and those are problematic. And so we have all sorts of different systems designed, and again, like melanin, absorbing that ultraviolet light before it becomes problematic for us, and skin, right? That's our big barrier against the sun.
Yeah.
It allows in some, but we don't want to get too much. I got a bit of a sunburn yesterday because I was surfing, and I know that you don't want to overdose, right? Yesterday I did for the waves, but not ideal long term. I was very dehydrated. I was thirsty. I was drinking yogurt all day. I was like, why am I so thirsty? Oh yeah, I got sunburned. Not good. But anyway, so blue light always foreshadows, he told me, the onset of ultraviolet. So there's always blue light coming before UV. So it makes perfect sense for an organism to choose blue to know that, yeah, the danger zone is coming, right? Another super interesting factoid, let's say, is if you use short, so why longer wavelength blue rather than shorter wavelength blue or even ultraviolet? Well, this is another fun, really fun experiment. We were driving down the road one time, and the doc, he asks me, and he's a PhD, also an MD, so a medical doctor, but also, studied a lot on the scientific side. And he asked me, do you notice a difference between, let's do a photonic experiment. Do you notice anything about the street signs? And I'm there with my COO, who was actually visiting at the same time. We're like, not a clue, and then he's like, the red and the blue ones, any thoughts? And we eventually noticed, well, the red ones look a little bit more faded. So if you go out and you look around anywhere, in general, red street signs and the red part of an American flag, for example, fades much faster than blue. And he said, well, why? And I was thinking, now my theoretical knowledge is being tested. And this is really the key, is can you put it into practice and really get to the conclusion? And honestly, I could not. But in that moment, I was kind of shocked. I didn't know what the answer was. So the answer is that if something appears red, it's because it's absorbing the shorter wavelengths of light and re-emitting the longer wavelengths, in this case, the reds. So it's actually absorbing and holding the blue and so on, even violet, ultraviolet, and so on, and re-emitting the rest. And that's why we see red, because it re-emits the red. And then on the other hand, a blue colored item or object is absorbing the longer wavelengths, the reds and so on, and re-emitting, or basically re-emitting, not just reflecting, but re-emitting the shorter wavelengths, the blue. So anyway, if a pigment has to absorb and neutralize and store the energy of shorter wavelengths, they have much more energy per photon than longer wavelengths. So those pigments, by definition, will degrade faster. So anything that's red will degrade faster. So in biology, any sensor or receptor that has to absorb ultraviolet light would degrade very quickly. So we have very few, if any at all, ultraviolet receptors. There may, from what I've researched, there may be just one or two significant ones, but the majority, for example, these sensors in our eye, so thereby use longer wave blue light, because it's kind of the edge of what makes sense for a sensor to absorb, where it's not going to degrade too quickly. So this was the perspective that he shared with me. I was like, wow, that makes a lot of sense. And now I'm completely sold. So anyway, just to, because I know we don't have a ton of time, but this is the good stuff, and I can give people the overview. This is the easiest part. Now that we've laid a foundation, everybody.
This is a master class in light, man. People are gonna.
I'm glad you like
have this for history. Yeah.
I'm glad you like it. So basically, what we know, putting aside any theory, medically speaking, biologically speaking, the researchers over the past 20 or so years have elucidated this system called the circadian rhythm, the circadian mechanism, the circadian system, chronobiology. And it largely began, the elucidation largely began with the discovery of this particular pigment in the eye called melanopsin. So it turns out we have another type of photoreceptor cell in our eye called, they named it not easy, intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. And these retinal ganglion cells contain this melanopsin pigment, which was formerly known to be just in frogs, like frog skins. And they're thinking, why is this in the human eye? And it turns out that this pigment, it's these cells are non-visual, meaning that they're not contributing to image forming like the rods and the cones. The rods primarily operating in low light conditions, the cones high definition, bright daylight color vision. The IPRGCs, which is the acronym for the retinal ganglion cells for short, and the melanopsin they contain, are wiring directly not to the hindbrain where we have our image forming centers, but directly across to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So this part, it's called the optical chiasm is where the optical nerves cross when they go back. So chiasm, the crossing point, and suprachiasmatic means it's above the chiasm. So that is the considered the master clock in the brain. It's one of the master controllers and regulators of our metabolism. And these particular cells that are absorbing this blue stimulus are communicating there. This shocked me when I first learned it. Now it just sounds like sciencey science stuff, but it shocked me because the way I first learned about this is that our eyes, we typically think of them as cameras, but really their primordial function was more like a clock, right? For timing. So sensing, because life has to, organisms that can adapt to changes have a higher chance of survival. So it's kind of a, let's say, foundation to that. It's a prerequisite to that, that we should definitely be able to adapt to regular, consistent, predictable changes. The largest, the most significant of which is the change. I mean, think on a daily basis, especially in Indonesia, the change of light, night and day, exactly.
Yeah.
From light to dark, there's this flaming ball of fire raining down photons upon you, which, if you weren't defended enough, would literally just break all of your atoms and molecules apart.
Right.
That's raining down all day, and it's hot. So if you're a complex advanced organism, you're sweating and so on. But that's also when everything comes to life under the power of the sun. Not everything, most, diurnal organisms, they come to life. And then that's when, people are going out and hunting, and animals are going out and hunting. Sometimes they do it at night, of course, depends on the situation, full moon, depends on the organism. But we need to be able to survive and defend against that big ball of fire. And then on the other hand, it gets really dark and really cold. In some places, it gets really, really cold. So you need to be able to adapt. So being able to adjust and adapt to those changes as both a very basic single-celled or, few-celled organism, all the way up to a complex organism like ourselves, we have more, let's call it metabolic flexibility, not in the sense of like you can eat carbs and you can eat fats, but the ability to operate at night as well. But we also know that if you do that consistently over time, and the research is very clear, shift workers have an increased incidence of all sorts of diseases. And I would have to attribute that to, circadian chronobiology disruption, and, lack of the beneficial wavelengths of light at the right time. And, in our world, especially excess of artificial light, which is throwing off the system, jacking up the cortisol levels at night. At least in nature, you wouldn't have an artificial jacking up of cortisol. You might get cortisol when you go and chase after an elk or something, but it wouldn't be happening all the time. And then, in nature, you're burning everything out. For example, like if I drink caffeine and I work out, I feel great. If I drink it and I don't work out, I get a bit anxious, right? And with cortisol, it's kind of similar. If you're not working it out, this is one of the other big issues Dr. Alexander pointed out to me. Anytime we're in daylight, this is a really good one. You're going to like this. So one of the reasons he argues that in all the lighting products we've been developing for the last few years, and we're really excited, they should be coming out this year. So the blue light protection eyewear that we make is just the beginning of it, of where we're going. But he argues that all modern lighting should be hormonally neutral. Why? Because many new, they call it human-centric lighting. He says this is not human-centric at all, actually, unfortunately. It actually uses blue light to try to stimulate the system. Well, the thing is, when we're indoors, we're almost always sedentary, right? So when you're outdoors, blue light causes us from the sun to make more cortisol, right? And then we're motorically active, we're moving, we're basically working through that. But we're sitting indoors, we're not moving at all. So, you get this imbalance where people's hearts are racing and people end up with all sorts of stress-related illnesses, and people get overwhelmed and are stressed. We already have enough stress from the corporate life and the modern life. we, at least at my company, we don't believe that we need to add more stress to people's lives with the light they're exposed to. We think we should do the opposite. And that's our premise. Whereas modern lighting engineers are saying, no, you should try to manipulate the circadian rhythm with blue light. We just argue, no, go out and get sunlight. Don't add more artificial light during the day. So hormonally neutral light is our goal. But anyway, as far as just covering off and making sure we've covered the key points on blue light. So blue light in the morning from the sun, of course, and everybody I think has heard at this point of Huberman, who really fortunately has brought this information out in a big way to the public, which I'm super grateful for, because I'm here developing the products mostly behind the scenes. I do some podcasts, but he's fortunately taken this information out where almost anybody is, who's knows what's happening in the Instagram sphere, let's say, or the Twitter sphere, knows about morning sunlight now, which is awesome I think for so many reasons. But morning sunlight sets this circadian rhythm, right? I've been saying this since 2017, 2016, when we first started making the blue light protection eyewear. Now, the reason we make blue light protection eyewear is specifically because, as I mentioned, blue light is this hormonally active range of light, which affects our chronobiology and therefore affects hormones, neurotransmitters, peptides, and so many other functions. And when we're outside in nature, our body is, let's just say, operating the way it was designed. We're moving, making more cortisol, but we're moving, we're using that, and we're active, right? Indoors, the artificial light spectra today have so much more blue light on a relative basis compared to the healing longer wavelengths of red, and they don't have any near infrared, as I mentioned earlier. So relatively, the protective balancing wavelengths that counterbalance, and there's solid evidence in vivo on cells exposed to blue and near infrared light at the same time. The cells exposed to only the blue light and not the near infrared actually degrade much faster, like their membranes literally degrade and fall and come apart when they're just exposed to blue. So near infrared, because of the mitochondrial enhancing benefits, it increases melatonin production and energy production and ATP. It offers this protective benefit. So modern lighting, just for anybody to understand, if you're in an office or a mall or something, blue light protection is very important for retinal health in particular. Otherwise, you're degrading the function of the retina. And this, as I mentioned already, you're overstimulating cortisol in an unnatural way. So that's, people always say, why blue light protection during the day? I get it at night, because at night, blue light's disrupting your sleep. But during the day, it does make sense. And finally, to wrap that up, in the evening, this is the one that everybody is starting to understand, fortunately, is that blue light at night literally just simply tricks your brain to think it's still day. So when you're supposed to be making melatonin in the absence of light, or with just like warm candle light, which doesn't contain blue, instead, the bright blue light from the TV, the iPad, the phone, and so on, the car headlights, street lights, the house lights especially, you're then making more cortisol, less melatonin, and people wonder why they can't sleep. They wonder why their kids are super hyperactive and they can't sleep. So that's where blue light protection for the evening, we have these, red.
I love these glasses. I wear the day ones during the day, the night ones at night. And so for people to get the benefits of it, for people that are, okay, I want to limit this blue light during the day, this artificial junk light from my screens and TV, how much to see the benefit during the day? You mentioned for the retina and for so many different things. What's your go-to recommendation?
Yeah, so the go-to for morning sunlight would be 10 to 15 minutes. This is pretty standard at this point as far as
You're saying getting morning sunlight without glasses, 10, 15 minutes. Okay.
Exactly. Go outside. If you could even take your shirt off, get the stimulus on your skin as early as possible, as close as possible to sunrise, because that's when the effect is the most profound, because there's such a significant shift at that time of the blue light content. And so that's when we would want to go out in the morning. Throughout the day, one of the points Dr. Alexander made to me even years ago when we first met was getting 2 hours of unfiltered daylight as a goal, right?
Okay.
That doesn't mean naked sunbathing, but at least out walking, right? Now that might sound actually difficult for the average person, but if you just go for a walk for an hour, hour and a half, you're pretty much there, right? You get some morning sunlight, just getting outside. Even if you're sitting next to a window, you can open the window, get a little daylight. But again, if you're in a place with strong sunlight, summer in the middle of the day, you don't want to overdo it. So this is a consideration for people as well. But anyway, getting that. And then as far as sunbathing, that's very difficult to give specific recommendations on, as you can imagine. But I would generally recommend that people sunbathe, 10 to 15 minutes per day in the summer. But if you have really dark skin, you might need a bit more. And if you have really light skin, you might need a bit less. And either way, you'll want to build up your exposure very slowly. Like in the Swiss Alps, before uh, penicillin and antibiotics and the canceling of all, the Flexner report and the canceling of all non evidence based medicine, which is just drug money, basically medicine. But
Yeah.
the Rockefeller story, and he hired
Yeah.
Flexner, and they basically said all non
Yeah.
evidence based
All
medicine.
natural
natural
medicine.
medicine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So before that, there were these guys in Switzerland, one leading physician named Auguste Rollier, a Swiss French heliotherapists. They were literally called sunlight therapists, heliotherapists.
Yeah.
And they cured and treated all sorts of diseases at these clinics up in the Alps by taking patients, and they would slowly expose them. Even the most severe cases where they're very sensitive, they would just expose their feet for the first minute or two on the first day. They'd roll their bed out into the sun. So they had these amazing terraces, and then they'd roll them back in. And then the next day it was up to their knees. And then the next day it was up to their thighs. And then the next day it was their torso, and then their face. And then finally the whole body, just increasing each one about a minute at a time. So the most sensitive people can still be conditioned to take a tan. And they were able to cure, well, back then, again, before antibiotics, lupus vulgaris, tuberculosis of the skin. They cured that with sunlight. They were able to heal wounds faster. I mean, there are magical, marvelous benefits to sunlight. So anyway, that's getting sunlight, and then finally in the evening to take advantage of these. Well, I'll add, and this is all part of what I call the light diet. But during the day, if you have to be indoors in an indoor environment for an extended period, using something like our daylight lenses to take the edge off, if you will, of the modern blue enriched LED lighting, to both protect retinal health and prevent this unnecessary and unnatural increased spike in our cortisol levels. Save that for when you're in the sun. And then at night, using something like the raw optics sunset lenses, which are designed, these block, the daylight lenses block already about 95% of all the blue light, just letting a little bit through to keep you, active and awake. And also to help with color perception, because during the day you want to see everything. At night, it's not really about color vision, because it's mostly the rods which are active at that point anyway. And so the sunset lenses do, of course, affect color vision significantly, but they significantly improve sleep quality. We had a partnership a few years ago with Aura, the maker of the sleep tracking ring, and we saw dozens of people. I mean, there were many more who didn't probably give their feedback, but thousands of people got the glasses, and hundreds gave us reviews, dozens of which were unbelievable.
Improved REM deep. I see this all the time clinically. I tell you, like for myself too, like I use the daytime ones and the sunset ones. For people that aren't watching this on social, it's a lighter yellow color for the daytime glasses. That's what the color the lenses are. And then for the evening ones, the sunset ones is like a darker amber colored one. So we're talking about two different colors that block different wavelengths. But anyways, I've tracked so many Oura rings and Whoop bands for telehealth patients, and the improvement of REM and deep sleep and heart rate variability when they're consistently using your glasses, it's time and time again. And for myself, it knocks me out. When I wear the nighttime ones, I can fall asleep within a couple minutes. I mean, you probably hear that all the time.
Yeah, it's amazing. For me, the best, I go back to my favorite story of all. I remember one particular evening with my friends as a kid where I had the glasses custom made back then before I started the company, because there was no product, and this is why I started the company. There was no product that both combined the lenses that block the right wavelengths based on the research, what the research was really saying you should block, and looked good and was stylish and high quality. So there were and still are tons of clear lens blue light glasses, which we can also discuss, but if you'd like. But they basically claim to block blue light, but they only block up to 420 nanometers. And blue light goes from 400 to 500. So if you only block up to 420, well, here's the catch. The blue light from screens and LEDs has a peak at 450 nanometers approximately. And so that's the peak. Now that actual spike goes from around 430 all the way up to, say, about 470. But if you're blocking all the blue light up to 420, you barely even graze the beginning of that spike of blue. And so these clear lenses, they block some blue light. And this is the trick. They'll send them out with a little blue laser, which you can shine. and then put it on a white piece of paper and show, oh, there's the laser, here's the lens, now it's gone. But that's a 405 nanometer LED. That is not the range of light that comes off of a screen or an LED light source. So it's a big, big
It's
deception.
like a
It's like a
marketing gimmick.
Huge
Yeah.
marketing scam. They're putting that forth now. But so contrarily, that's why, I created these products. So I was on the couch with a couple buddies hanging out at a friend's house when I was like 17, wearing my custom made blue blocking glasses at that time. And I was falling asleep. And I just remember them always giving me a hard time. They're like, dude, they're trying to take my glasses. They're like, take your glasses off. You're no fun, bro. You're just getting tired. You want to go home and go to sleep at 9 every night. I'm like, man, it's my circadian rhythm, guys. Like, come on, So that was me as a teenager. But
I love it.
It's fortunate. We had athletes even come to us and say, like, they try the glasses. One in particular comes to mind. She was the #1 women's soccer player in the world. She's still in the top level, and she starts wearing them, and she's like, guys, my HRV went up a lot. Is that supposed to happen? We're like, yeah, it's normal. We've seen it before.
Yeah, it's so true, man. So this is great. I mean, I use your products. I recommend it to telehealth patients. And like you said too, which we're talking so deep on the science and the effectiveness of the why it works for people. And eye strain has gone down tremendously throughout the day when I wear the daylight ones, because I'm in telehealth, so I'm looking at a screen all day long. I don't have them on right now. I should have them. I'm a bad patient. But in the evenings, my sleep's improved. So it's a game changer. You've saved my eyes and saved my nervous system, circadian rhythm. So thank you.
Well, I'd love to get you an extra pair to just park on your desk. So
Yes.
no
excuses. I have. And I was going to say too is that the design, like you said, I don't want to look like a biohacker. I loved them, but I don't want to look like that sort of, what I'm talking about. They're not into but you guys make it look really, it's just cool. It's just really good style, but it's effective from a science and a health benefit standpoint. So I do appreciate it.
I really appreciate that. We're also, we're actually in the process of even overhauling our collection. That'll take a good while, 6 months or so. But so we're really looking to just continue to level up. We always do, both on the lens technology. I didn't mention too much of this, but with Dr. Wunsch in Germany, we since we started working together a few years back, he has custom developed particular tests for ensuring that our lenses excel in quality above everything else that we're sure nobody else is using, because we created it. And the factories we work with have never seen these kinds of tests that we use for quality control purposes. But in some ways, they're also quite simple. We're using high intensity blue light to ensure that it's a stress test. So we just for example, stress test the lenses to ensure that under very intense lighting conditions over short periods of time and long periods of exposure, the lenses hold up, right? That's super important. We use particular tests to make sure that the color rendering of the lens is optimal, especially in the case of the daylight lens. For the sunset lens, once you block out all the green, the color perception is almost non-existent. It's less relevant, although it's still better, considerably better, I should say, than the kind of super biohacker mega dark red versions, which we've also determined are not even necessarily better. They could even be worse, because the darker the lens, the pupil starts to get even wider, letting in more light in some cases. So there is a kind of fine balance between blocking the wavelengths indicated by the science and not just saying we're just going to
diminishing returns. Yeah,
exactly. Just because we're a biohacker, we're going to, break our neck because we trip over our own feet in our living room.
More isn't always better. If nothing else, that's the theme of this episode. Throughout, it's the through line of it all. Yeah.
So if do you have another minute or two? I could actually do a demo real quick.
Yeah.
Those on video.
For those that are watching this on social and on YouTube, they could see this. So you are pulling up a screen.
I have a spectrometer here. This
is digital spectrometer.
Yeah. So basically it's blank right now. So I'm going to point it at a white note so that you get like the full sense of a white background. So I have a white note here, and I'm pointing that on my computer. And so you can see here, one moment. Come on, give me the reading. There we go. So you see here, this is RGB. So there's red, green, blue, and that the mixture of those three, the level changes of those three, give you the different colors you see on a screen.
Yeah. So you were measuring the spectrum that it was emitting.
Yeah, exactly. I'm measuring the spectrum of the computer screen. Now I'm going to take this is a so-called blue light lens from a leading manufacturer of
So
lenses.
for people that are listening this and not seeing this, it's one of those blue light blocking glasses that's clear with a slight iridescent, but it's pretty much clear.
Yeah, it's pretty much clearish coating. So this will block up to 420, as I mentioned. But so if we look closely at this range of light here, that blue spike from the screen doesn't start until round about 430 nanometers with a peak
Got it.
around 4.
So he measure yeah. So you're measuring the frequency of the computer screen, and a phone screen is going to be similar to that. It is not blocking. Those sort of clear blue light blocking glasses is not doing the job.
Well, so here, yeah, I have the clear lens and I'm putting it right in front, and then we can just confirm the hypothesis here. So now I've taken another reading. It doesn't change.
Doesn't change at all. So you're sitting all getting the blue light. Yeah, got it.
Yeah,
So
now,
it's not affected.
fortunately, since we started the podcast, daylight has sprung. So I just pointed this towards the window, and we do have a reading of daylight there. That is what a continuous spectrum looks like. Look how
Got
much
it.
red and near red you have right
Yeah,
there.
yeah. So this is like versus the computer screen is like this sort of sort of violent spikes of a few. You're seeing like a full spectrum with a lot of different.
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
it's a full spectrum. Exactly.
Yeah.
Daylight spectrum. So now here I'll show with this blue light lens real quick. Keep an eye on this short wavelength range below 420 nanometers. So right around there. And I'll point this again the same exact direction. There is a reduction. You see that 420 is reduced significantly there, but that's not the range coming off of the screen. So these could offer some degree of sunlight protection,
Yeah.
but they're not offering blue light protection, and they're sold as screen lenses. That's the kicker.
Yeah.
Right? So anyway, now I take the daylight lens, the raw daylight lens, and I put it in front of the sensor, and I'm going to test this right up against the screen. And then here you can see the blue is completely removed. So we remove that hormonally active stimulating range of light,
Got it.
which can disrupt our hormones, our neurotransmitters, the endocrine system in general. And then the sunset lenses I'm now going to measure and keep an eye on that green range. So this is for maximum sleep effect. But before I do that, I just want to emphasize, you made a great point. When people wear these, what it's going to do is give them a reduction in eye strain, headaches, fatigue, dry eyes.
During the day.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so these factors associated with the effects of this blue light on the retina. And then there's the associated hormonal disruption and stress and so on and so forth. And what we have found, both from my experience and our team and our customers, is that when you don't have this increase in stress, you don't have eye strain, headaches, and fatigue, you can actually be more productive. So
Totally.
that's a great, everybody wants to be more productive and focused and have a positive, light, elevated mood. So those are the daylight lenses. Now the sunset lenses, after the sun goes down, we put these on. And so I'm going to measure these against the screen. And then here you see the green light's gone as well. So basically the reason to move green isn't the evil or something like this, of course. It's just, it's in the shorter wavelength range of the light spectrum, closer to blue compared to red, where it still has a bit more of a stimulating effect on the organism. So I found from my own experience that I feel more tired faster when I wear the, red orange lenses, the sunset lenses, compared to when I wear the yellow lenses, the daylight lenses. And that's natural. We don't want to fall asleep when we're wearing daylight lenses. We just want to literally take the edge off of the LED spike. And in the evening, we just want to kind of block everything that's relevant, not all the light, of course, because otherwise you'd be the bio with a blindfold on. Hey, I'm up.
No, I can still watch my shows. I can still hang out with my wife and watch our Netflix shows at night and have my glasses on, and I fall asleep like a baby. So I love it, man.
Like old school sepia, kind of a little more red orange, but you adjust very quickly. So anyway, that's my demo. Thank you.
I love it. So for people that are watching this on YouTube, you saw it, but what we saw is a significant drop in these wavelengths we don't want during the day and at night from our screens. So great stuff, man. I love it. Real time data measuring light on the pod. I've never had that happen before, but thanks. It's been a first. So where do people go? I've loved this conversation. Where do people go to learn more about the amazing work you're doing and get these glasses?
Yeah, so people can go to rawoptics.com. That's raoptics.com. Ra is the Egyptian god of sunlight. And so it's a fitting name as a company. We're
It
making,
is.
health lighting and light therapy products and therapeutic eyewear. So raoptics.com, people can join our email list. We send out a lot of cool and interesting information of updates and sales and things like this as well. When we have new celebrities wearing our glasses, we share that because it happens, it seems like every week now. But we have people like Rick Rubin, the amazing producer, and Erling Haaland, the amazing soccer player from Manchester City, and just tons of these top performers and executives are using the product. So we like to share stuff like that, and then customer reviews. Also, Instagram, people can go to raw_optics, and then if somebody wants to follow me, I respond to my Instagram messages. It's the light diet. So instead of a food diet, it's a light diet. Food's
Nice.
important too, of course.
Yeah, I love it. This has been a blessing, man. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Will. I appreciate it.